All right, so it's now time to bring out our keynote speaker, Geoffrey Colon. Geoffrey Colon is a senior communications designer at Microsoft, where he evangelizes the company's products for customers. He is a compelling voice at the intersection of marketing, tech, media, and popular culture. Data punk, DJ, podcaster, steampunk, and author. Colon is the author of the book Disruptive Marketing, What Growth Hackers, Data Punks, and Other Hybrid Thinkers Can Teach Us About Navigating the New Normal. He has written The Futurist, The Futurist, Advertising Age, and Fast Company, and been quoted in Forbes, Billboard Magazine, The Huffington Post, The Guardian, and the Los Angeles Times. He has also hosted the weekly business and culture podcast, Disruptive FM. We're very lucky to have him. He's here today to talk about marketing in the era of an attention economics. Please welcome Geoffrey Colon, everybody. You good there? The dramatic slow approach. Oops.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, glad to be here. I wanted to start with this quick video that ties into the overall theme of what we're going to talk about today.
Competition that try to compete. Stand back, watch the bomb drop. All the competition that try to compete. Stand back.
Okay, so we'll come to this in a little bit in the presentation, but I want you to think about what you were feeling when you were watching those two hands on the turntable. Very similar to how we may feel when we're watching video of someone surf, because this plays into a big part of where attention is going, which actually goes back to sort of an old era of how we are as human beings. So where we are in the world now is we have all this information, almost too much of it in this day and age, but we have this sort of dot that of things of what we need to know. So we're trying to reach an audience, and they're that small dot on the map, and yet there's this entire world that we have to play in, basically. So there's three problems we're going to address today, and we're going to answer 6 questions that hopefully will have some takeaways that you can take back and think about and stew on and talk a little bit more in terms of what you want to do with your business. The 3 problems that we have to address as brands right now. One is there is a wealth of information that creates a poverty of attention. We don't have to even talk about this if we have daily conversations with people. I'm sure many of you will hear from someone who said, hey, did you hear this news? And you're like, what news are you talking about? Because there's so many things that are happening in our world. The second is we think too much of rational economics when it comes to measuring attention. So this is a big problem with sort of the financialization of business now. Everyone's trying to put metrics on everything. And it's sort of hard to put metrics on attention, which we have not been able to do as neuroscientists or sociologists. And we think about some of those business metrics, we hear a lot of terms thrown around. ROI is a big one, return on investment or return on advertiser spend. Again, really hard to note if you have a bunch of impressions on things that you're doing if actually people are paying attention to you. How do you measure that? People may see things, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have their undivided attention. And problem 3, while the web is infinite, your mind is not. And this is sort of where we run into problems, and I think it's interesting because when I was putting this presentation together, my wife was saying, you're talking to a bunch of surfers. They know that they have to have attention, because if they don't pay attention when you're out on a wave, like basically the earth will swallow you. So this is an interesting sort of visual of the marketing technology world that we live in right now. And it's interesting to look at this map because there's 6,000 different companies out there that do marketing technology. And I like to show this to groups that I talk to, because many times they say, hey, we don't really have to do any marketing or any word of mouth or really anything. We'll just build something and it'll come. And then I show them this and they're like, wait a minute, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. A map like this exists for all industries, including the surf industry as well. And this, of course, is just a few of the players that are out there. And it doesn't cover all the other ones that are in their bedroom or their garage that are trying to figure out how to tap into supply chain management systems to create what basically are the next players. So we're basically moving to a world where there is an abundance of solutions, an abundance of brands now. So 6 questions we're going to ask and answer here, and hopefully you can take away some of the feedback to figure out how we measure attention, how we can actually utilize some of this information in running our day-to-day. So question 1, what do we think about when we're trying to reach people with a wealth of information and a poverty of attention? One of the things that too many marketers do now is they think of channels, so they immediately go to where do people spend time? Do they spend it on the web? Are they within social media platforms? Do they read certain publications? Where are they, in the physical world? Where are they in the digital world? And of course, we come back to almost all the technology players that exist out there in terms of how people may spend their time. The problem with thinking this way, though, is many of these platforms are sort of just the middle ground. They're what we call, hey, they take basically money to try to get to an audience. So they're basically stakeholders. All of those companies that I listed are making money off of attention. When you do a Google search, you basically can buy placement through AdWords to figure out how you're top of search engine result pages. If you do a promoted post within a social feed, you can basically intersect where anyone may have an interest. But that doesn't really, that doesn't lead to all the solutions that I think we're looking for in terms of how we identify with the audiences that we're trying to reach. So what we want to ask instead is, how do people pay attention? What actually means paying attention to something? And if we go back to neuroscience and look at what causes people to pay attention to something, they're paying attention to things and people because they actually are doing something that we call mirroring systems. And this goes back to the slide that I had in terms of the person who was DJing at the beginning. Even if you've never DJed, in your mind you're trying to figure out, how did that person move their hands? Why are they doing certain things? What's causing them to actually take those actions? We do the same thing with anything that we might be interested in life, even if we have never done it. So a good example of this is in the fashion world. The reason why we do advertising or runway shows or show video on fashion is because we're basically trying to tap into that mirror system. Someone can see, wait a minute, what's that going to look like on me if I wear that? It also leads into something that's called mirroring intent. So if you look at the sports world, and there's plenty of athletes that we follow, even if we don't play tennis, we know that Venus Williams, if we watch her in a match, we're sort of figuring out, or we're paying attention to the moves that she makes, and in our mind, subconsciously, we're trying to figure out, well, how does she make those moves? And if she makes certain moves that we like, we bond with her and we actually start to root for her. We actually might, scream at the television a little bit more. I think we all know these people when we're in a sports bar, when you're watching a game and you're sort of moving around even though your movement has no outcome on the game that athlete is actually playing. That's falling into these sort of mirroring intent. And we do this with a variety of different athletes. We also do it in other areas. We do it in politics, unfortunately. I'd like to think that we actually follow people who actually we believe in, but a lot of it actually falls into this sort of mirroring intent and mirroring systems. It also falls into advertising. This is a famous ad from the 2000s where basically Apple is trying to figure out, are you going to get behind the nerdy geek on the left-hand side who's the PC, or are you going to get behind the cool person who's on the right-hand side who's the Mac? So beyond the most glancing attention to more than one thing at any one moment, we stumble. And again, we know this. If we're out surfing we're not paying attention to really anything else except what we're doing in the moment. This is what's also interesting when it comes to multitasking, because we still have this belief we can do lots of different things at once. But when we've measured the brain and tried to figure out if we can do that, it's absolutely impossible. We're actually better when we're deep thinkers and doers, and we actually can isolate what we're trying to do. So solution one, based on that query, is we want to understand the motivations of our audience via mirroring intent. And I think the culture that you're in understands this more than anyone, because basically you have created something that most people want to fall into because they want to mirror that intent. I remember being in middle school in the 80s. I grew up on the East Coast. We had to drive an hour to the Jersey Shore basically to get into the water, and everybody dressed like a surfer or a skater. That's mirroring intent, because it falls into sort of this feeling once again that we want to be part of something that's bigger, even if we are not one of those participants ourselves. Query number two that we want to ask here is, we want to create an online community movement culture for our brand. This one's really interesting because it ties into subcultures, which we all really know about here in this room more than anyone, especially the fact that surf culture really created subcultures. If we look back on the history of how it has evolved. So again, we ask a lot of the questions of where should we build these online, and it leads back to this whole thing of, well, should we be on these platforms, these media areas, these solutions in which the tech companies provide. And again, those are news feeds, and they're basically channels. They're what we call partial communities. Again, it's a way to get to someone, but it's not really a true community per se. It's almost like the road that allows you to get to a particular community. There's an interesting thing that we should take away in terms of when it comes to building communities, because there's this belief system that we have to have lots of people in our communities in order to be vibrant. And again, that goes back to the fact that ROI and ROAS, return on investment, is so important. We're always looking at the numbers. Alvin Toffler, who was a British anthropologist, said you only really need 150 people in life to make a difference, because that's really all that you can manage. And that's why I think when it comes to starting subcultures or sub-brands, many companies have figured out, hey, how do we actually get 150 pieces of clothing to 150 people who are influential? The smarter companies have figured out that you don't need quantity, you actually need quality. That will actually spread over a long period of time. This is another reason why small brands have actually sort of eclipsed some of the bigger brands, because they're operating with the intent of using sort of Robin Dunbar's number. Hey, we only have to reach 150 people. It's who will those 150 people reach? The other big thing is face-to-face, or what we call IRL, in real life, or offline. This is a big area now in post-digital. So many people are getting tired of spending time online because they feel that they're lonely. There was actually an article that came out this past week that measured loneliness among younger people. It's higher than ever. We're more connected, but we're more lonely. So it's actually interesting, because how do we actually create community that gets us to do what we're doing here? We're all physically here. We all can talk to each other. We can all share stories and laugh. Humans are social animals, and we actually should pay more attention to how we build some of these offline communities, these meetups, etc. And there's lots of pictures here, including one from last year at SEMA. So this is a big area now for brands where they're actually trying to say, how do we actually bring lots of people together, and that will then replace or actually amplify what's happening online. And we call this Insta Syndrome. And we're all familiar with this, because what you do offline then allows it to spread online. But it's interesting to see what things are picked up and what things are not picked up. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to be the most crazy thing. It actually has to feel in a way that's relevant to the audience at hand. One of the things that we see with Insta Syndrome now is how technology is blurring with the physical world. This is what we call this crazy term, phygital. I know, I didn't invent it. People like to sort of map these things together. It's physical and digital, and one of the examples I'm going to show on this video is what you think is actually art can be brought to life through augmented reality. So I bring up this example because I think one of the areas in many industries now is how are you going to tap into this sort of digital world? One thing that I think is interesting too in terms of, surf culture, and I've only been able to surf at Rockaway Beach in New York City as an East Coaster and not really on the West Coast, is many people actually want to feel what it's like to be in the water, but they'll never have a chance to do that. And I think this is where virtual reality and augmented reality is going to open this up to an entirely new audience that may never ever touch the ocean. So solution 2, think about what you can do offline that will reverberate online. And while the web is infinite, our mind is not, and we know that real life experiences are going to create those lasting mirror systems that I talked about. So query 3, what makes people want to share? So looking at this, there's a lot of psychological traits of sharing. 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, the New York Times did a whole study on why people want to share. And of course, they were looking at it from like a social perspective, like why do people share online? But I think it harkens back to like us as people, like why do people share things? What's our meaning of life and why we want to share information and share resources, etc. And it came down to 7 traits that they discovered. I think this is a little bit more complex than this, but they sort of looked at altruists and careerists, hipsters, boomerangs, connectors, selectives. What they found is there were different types of people that shared information because they were going to get reciprocity from that. It was what they actually were going to gain from the share and why they did it, why they actually took time to do things. And we see this quite a bit in terms of why do people share information when it comes to fashion trends or things that are actually happening in culture. We're seeing much, much more of this now in a variety of different industries because people are fascinated with actually moving the needle in what we call intersectionality. You have maybe the tech industry and you have the fashion industry, but when you merge those together, what's the new thing that you get out of that? So the question also is, why do we share? And we came up there with some answers here in terms of bringing value and entertaining content to others, defining yourself to others when you share things online, growing and nourishing relationships. There's a big movement now on meeting people online, but then actually saying, hey, when are we going to actually meet up in life? For self-fulfillment or to get the word out about causes that you care about. This then brings up the discussion of, over-targeting. So we think about Robin Dunbar's number and 150 people. The one problem that some industries have is they sort of keep things to themselves. It's like, hey, this thing amongst ourselves, we have our crew and we don't really need to spread it to anybody else. The problem with that is you're not getting anybody new in the tent. And what basically has happened is there's this big promise of big data now saying, hey, let's just segment audiences of who we need to go after. That's all we need to reach, and we'll basically make ends meet from that. The movement now is actually how do you open the tent up a little bit more? How do you get more people into it? And this quote sort of reminds me of that. This is Keith Weed of Unilever. He says, if you get too targeted, you reinforce people who love your brands to buy more, but there are only so many cups of tea you can drink in a day. And I think this is the issue that almost every industry is having, is they're basically trying to hyper-focus on a particular customer and not realizing how people evolve, that we actually change careers, that we actually evolve over time. And this is an interesting thing that we should pay attention to, especially when it comes time to actually reaching beyond the tent that we are in currently. So if we looked at that first model we had at the beginning with the little target, what we need to know in the sort of world, the big thing now is how do you draw a little, like a bigger circle around that so you reach people with information who we would consider light or non-buyers. Again, thinking of the story from back in the 80s when I lived on the East Coast and I wanted to dress like a surfer. Who are those people? How do you reach those people? How do you actually become part of their day-to-day, beyond just the core? So solution 3, we want to question data. We want to counterintuitively opt for targeting broader audiences and be what you are, but just to more people. which leads us to the fourth query. Are audience identifiers dated? And when we look at this, what we found is that if we use more broad reach campaigns, again, campaigns that reach a little bit beyond who our audience is, they're still the best way to drive market share. Because marketing is really a game about numbers. And the higher those numbers can be, the more effective you're going to be overall. That's just marketing 101. But it's always good to reaffirm that with everyone when we talk to each other, because it's like, oh, wait a minute, we're maybe missing a lot of other people we could bring into our market share. The good news is that the digital revolution has increased the potential effectiveness for most forms of marketing, including traditional media. This is why things like billboards and analog advertising aren't dead yet. I think what's really fascinating is Facebook was having issues a few months ago, and obviously Mark Zuckerberg had to be pulled in front of Congress. What's the one thing that Facebook did to sort of point out their issue? Does anyone want to raise their hand and answer? What's the one thing that they did to sort of say, hey, like, we know that there's this issue and we're going to sort of get down to it? Is that it? Advertisement where? Yes, print media. They took a big advertisement out in the New York Times. So again, how do you actually use some of these traditional forces to influence what's happening in some of the newer areas? So when people say like that stuff's dead and gone, it's not really dead and gone. Power just sort of weaves from one area to another. And then third, firms that invest at the right level and in the right way, mass marketing is still working better than ever, which goes against what a lot of companies want you to believe, which is basically, hey, you should hyper-target, you should just go after your audience, that's how you're going to actually perform. The bigger thing now is actually, wait a minute, maybe we should expand that circle and use a little bit more mass marketing to meet our ends. So we have lots of different descriptions on for how we look at people in terms of demographics. I'm sure a lot of us are probably sort of tired of this. And the reason we're tired is because we're much more complex when we really look at it. If we actually sat down and we all talked and said, like, what we're interested in, our common bond might, we might have similarities in some areas, but in a lot of other areas, we're going to be like very, very different. And that's what's so interesting. And I always like to use this example of Cara Beth Burnside because she's so complex as a person. A lot of people just think of her as a skateboarder, but she's actually all into like a lot of other things. So if I had to target her with advertising or target her with a message, it'd be quite difficult. Because if I just sort of hyper-targeted her and said, hey, I want to go after someone who likes skateboarding, she's also into a lot of other things as well. And that leads us to this fact that we're in this era now with a surf fight of subcultures, which again, I don't have to explain to this group because you sort of invented the subculture as we know it. But we're basically coming full circle again where we have tons of different subcultures that we can take advantage of. And the question now is how do we actually use that to our advantage to understand what these subcultures are, what they want, how they intersect with other subcultures. This has led to this great phenomena called the Insta fashion brands, which I'm sure I don't have to tell you a lot about. What's happening in the fashion world now is you have all these boutique brands that sort of I call them nibblers. They don't need to build and become like the Nikes and Adidases of the world. They just have to nibble away at Nike and Adidas' market share. If they get 2% of that, they're great. A good example of this is Dollar Shave Club. When they launched with a simple video. They didn't think they would get to a ton of people, but it actually was created to sort of get out to the masses, not hyper-targeted. And ultimately, it took away 4% of P&G's market share. That scared P&G, but for Dollar Shave Club, they were like, hey, this is awesome. We have about 25 employees. We have a sustaining business. We don't really need to worry about anything else. What I found really interesting at the end of the day is Dollar Shave Club basically, or I should say P&G was rescued by their competitor, Unilever, because Unilever bought Dollar Shave Club. So I always had asked people who had worked on PR for Procter & Gamble, hey, how come you didn't create your own Dollar Shave Club? Why didn't you come up with that solution on your own? which again leads to this whole area now of why don't bigger brands come up with sub-brands that they allow to operate on their own with 1 or 2 employees that aren't part of the mothership. That's how you discover the future. And this is an interesting area that we have to watch as more and more brands use Instagram basically to sell goods from and also figure out what the sort of new supply chain management is in these areas. So solution 4, see your audience as people whose choices change constantly based on context instead of narrowly defined segments with short, predictable lists of priorities and motivations. So query 5, why do behavioral economics matter? So again, this is an area that probably a lot of us are like, oh geez, I don't really want to pay attention to economics. But it's really the intersection of people and economics and context. Why are certain things more popular than others at a given time of the year or a given time in history? And I think when we look at this, I love to give this example, or this whole section. What we're going to actually look at is from the 1970s till now. How was context basically interpreted? How did behavioral economics actually influence fashion and music? So when we think about the 1970s economy, it was stagflation. This is where you have an area of low growth, so you don't have a lot of employment, and high inflation. So it basically, if we had to pick if we looked at fashion in the 1970s, what's interesting about this is there's not a lot, you have shorts, I should say, but there's a reason for that. You don't have a lot of money, so you want to make things actually like shorter. And that seems to be the style at the moment, or I should say that was the style sort of in that era. And if we actually looked at music, we sort of moved away from the corporate rock into this sort of dirgy heavy metal, punk rock, disco hip hop era. And there's a song that comes to relevance that defines the 1970s. It's Black Sabbath's Iron Man. And the reason why I picked this song is because basically Iron Man is this fictitious character that's just so tired of the world that he just wants to come and wipe everything out. That really defines what stagflation is. So let me just play like a quick snippet from this, and then we'll move into the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. In the 80s, we moved into Reaganomics. So this actually created some interesting things because you had high growth areas, but you still had some areas of the economy being left behind. And of course, surf fashion, of course, looked pretty colorful at that time. Again, because, hey, we want to sort of show off our wealth in some of these areas. And music probably was interesting because it sort of mirrored the fact that you moved from DIY punk to sort of glam new wave, heavy metal, shiny pop, so to speak. If there's one song that probably had to, commemorate this era, and again, when we have a drink later at the bar, I hope you think I'm cold, I gotta play this song that really shows the era, that's Poison's Unskinny Bop. And the reason why I bring this up is because basically everything is contrived. It's overproduced. The representatives in the band basically had high hair and crazy fashion. It was like the antithesis of being authentic in some respects. And I'm sure many of you are familiar of it. Again, I just want to play a couple riffs of it. And then we'll go into the fringe part of the 1980s, because this is an area that's important when we talk about the surf
Hey guys, how
subcultures.
you doing? Hey guys, can you take care of that? We gotta rehearse this. Well, are we gonna dance or are we gonna play?
right, so don't hurt me later. If we look at unskinny bop and what existed there, we have to look at sort of the subcultures that existed in the 1980s. Hardcore punk's a big one, 7 Seconds a big band, their album The Crew. And the reason we have to look at this is because this is identifying, hey, what's mass isn't really as important sometimes in terms of what's on the fringe and then how do you make that mass. We also look at another subculture, Public Enemy, big one as well in terms of where hip-hop sort of exploded. So it moves more toward a tipping point. All right, so in the 90s, then we moved toward recession. So we moved from Reaganomics back to another recession. And if we look at surf fashion, big thing we have to look at is Stussy. Again, really captured everybody in the heartland. A lot of people in the Midwest who are nowhere near the ocean donned Stussy like it was going out of style. I remember I was so mad when I was in college because someone stole my Stussy hat. And it was really expensive actually to buy in the first place. And if we look at the music sort of context at that time, we had grunge and gangster rap and sort of the rise of sample culture. And what was happening here is people sort of were taking off with trying to figure out how do you do things by yourself with low technology, which is interesting when we get to a few slides from now where we want to actually look and say, are we repeating ourselves in terms of that economy? So the song, of course, that represents that, Dr. Dre, the next episode.
It's the one and only Nico Double G. You know what I'm with the D.R.E.
So then we have the 2000s economy and basically a collapse in a lot of respects. We had surf fashion at the time got a lot more vibrant. It was a lot more mainstream at this time. The interesting thing, though, that was the reason why it was a collapse is because things, again, go back to the 80s. It was very polished. You had things that were overproduced. And for this next song, I'm going to skip through it real quickly, because otherwise I don't think anybody's going to talk to me, and that was Nickelback's How You Remind Me. So we're going to just skip through that quickly. So then we move into the 2010s and this sort of entrepreneurial empowerment that we've lived in the last decade or so, which we're sort of getting to the tail end of. And surf fashion, again, sort of trying to figure out where it might move in terms of new audiences, how it looks outside the ocean, how it might look a little bit more on the formal side of the spectrum. And music from that era, obviously we have more female pop stars, indie hip hop and indie rock. And we had to pick a song from that era as Taylor Swift's Bad Blood. And the reason why I picked this sort of song is because it sort of combines, again, the empowerment with a lot of production, with sort of the entrepreneurial nature that exists in this current decade. But if we have to think about now, and where we're headed in the next couple of years, this song probably best exemplifies it. So I'll just let you listen. In the next couple of years, because we're converging everywhere. All economies are converging for scale, converging for creative use, converging because there's people from one set reaching another set. The reason why Los Angeles' economy is so interesting is because you have people who used to work in the film industry, the entertainment industry, the video gaming industry, as well as cultural industries, all sort of getting together and trying to figure out what's the new areas that we can explore. That's pretty exciting, that cross-pollination. And that's really what we want to think about when we leave here is how do we cross-pollinate with some industries that we may have not thought about in the past to sort of find the future. So what could surf fashion look like? There was an article this past year called, that said our early 2000s surf brands making a major comeback. Again, because things are all cyclical. That's really, I think, up for us to decide how we want to tie into the context, the economics of the time to take things forward. So solution 5, contextual relevance allows you to be discovered by people who understand that you get it, or being contextually unique allows you to be discovered by people who also understand that you get it. So, basically falling into a place where if you're hitting at the right time, at the right moment, and you have sort of all the right synergies, it's going to explode, and not necessarily explode to a lot of people, but explode based on that Robin Dunbar number, and then it explodes and cascades from there. Now, before we get to the 6th solution, there's an evolution of attention that I want to make sure that we all pay attention to, and this basically looks at the sort of 3 waves of attention and how they've worked within communication over the past couple of decades. In that first wave, most things were based on if it bleeds, let it lead. This is why you always have fires that led with the local news. This is why you always put a picture of something drastic happening on the front page of the newspaper. And to give a good example of this, I'm going to show you this video.
Because we're adding a little something to this month's sales contest. As you all know, first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado. Anybody want to see second prize? Second prize is Interstate, guys. Third prize is your fire. A, B, C. A, always be B, C, closing. Always be closing. Always be closing. AIDA, attention, interest, decision, action. Attention, do I have your attention? Interest, are you interested? I know you are, because it's fuck or walk. You close or you hit the bricks. Decision, have you made your decision for Christ? And action. AIDA, get out there. You got the prospects coming in. You think they came in to get out of the rain? A guy don't walk on the lot unless he wants to buy. They're sitting out there waiting to give you their money. Are you with a ticket?
All right, so AIDA, attention, interest, decision, action, a very methodical approach to try to get anybody to buy anything when you're trying to sell it. This has sort of moved into a second wave, which we're actually moving out of, but it was basically, if it's outrageous, it's contagious. So the more outrageous you could do something, the more contagious it was. This was, basically the era of, let's try to make things as crazy as possible. What we're moving into now is, if it evokes action, it has traction. And we see this around us with tons of different movements that are happening online and offline. Some of them political, more societal, that really try to sort of ask the questions on, what's the meaning for why we're here? Let's say we all live till maybe we're just like 90 years old. That's a short time span when we look at the sort of larger history of the world. And then basically there are 4 elements of popular culture when people are looking at this third wave that they're trying to tap together when they think about how do we tie in all these different areas of attention economics to reach the people that we want to. One of them is close culture, one of them is deep culture, one of them is mass culture, and one is crowd culture. I think the one that we paid attention to the most was really just mass culture for the time being, but we didn't realize that they played off of the other 3 as well. So if we actually can play in this sort of like area, these 4 areas, we have the ability to actually create some interesting chemistry. We also have this one other sort of effect that I like to bring attention to when I talk to people, and that's called the conjoint effect. What's happening is, because everyone's merging in the same small place, like basically the small playground online, everybody's stealing each other's ideas. This is why when you look at some brands, you're like, why do they actually act human? And then you look at some humans and they actually act like brands. It's what's known as the conjoint effect. And we're going to see more and more of this when we actually ask people, do you feel like you're a brand? 70% say yes, 60% think someone should do a movie about them. So more and more we actually see this area of convergence, which can be both scary as well as interesting at the same time. So the final query, will visuals and videos always be the best way to gain attention? I think the interesting thing now is as we move toward this new world, there's all this technology around us that can listen and talk to us. And this is an area that we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to in the next couple of years, no matter what industry we're in. And one of those things that I find interesting is tapping into the power of smart speaker devices. So here's an example of Alexa, open search hacks.
Welcome to Search Hacks, sponsored by Bing, Bing Network, Intelligent Search. Say search if you want to learn a best practice. Say hack if you want to learn a tip. Say stop if you want to exit.
Search.
You chose search. Here's a good advertising tip. Advertising on a search engine is a pay-per-click system. You bid based on how much you are willing to pay per each click.
So these are all skills basically now, which is really fascinating because we live in a world where we can learn, unlearn, and relearn at a rapid rate. And in the next couple of years, it'll be interesting to, as we basically speak to more devices, what information can we gain from that? I think one of the things that bogs down a lot of smaller companies that are trying to build more sustainable franchises is you're bogged down with a lot of process. How wonderful would it be if you could actually say, what are the numbers for this month? And a report is pulled for you. That allows you to actually be liberated to be more creative and actually figure out what is our strategy for our business. Heck, if it gives you 2 more hours to be out in the ocean, that's a good thing as well. So in summation, we want to learn how people pay attention, mirroring systems, and basically figuring out how we learn from one another. That offline converts to online. That this whole sort of belief that we just have to do things online is a myth in some respects. We're social animals and we inhabit physical spaces. And we want to target more broadly. Even though Robin Dunbar's number is good to get things started, as we move along that chain, how do we expand so we actually reach new audiences? Also understanding your new audiences may have not been around 10 years ago when you think that they have, and that's a new audience to take advantage of. And that you see your audiences as people, not simply data, that move in and out of different areas of their life. We also want to pay attention to economics and context. Are we on a wave once again to go through a 2000 resurgence, or is that all hubbub? And then we want to think accessibility. Visuals are not the only way to attract attention. Now we can tap into voice and skills. I'm Geoffrey Colon. I'm author of the book Disruptive Marketing. I work at Microsoft. Thanks again for your time today. Yeah, the questions from the audience, yeah.
Anyone? No cues? Okay. You were that good. Oh, yeah, okay. Shane.
So, is there anything in your professional opinion, like what could be the next Instagram or social media platform that may, be the thing of the future?
Yeah, good question. Because I sort of study them a bit. Messaging is obviously a big area that has existed for some period of time. The thing that's interesting about messaging platforms is they're encrypted, so there's no way to really figure out what people might be talking about. The oldest form of messaging, obviously, is SMS, when you have like a group text. The wonderful thing about that is you and like 3 or 4 other friends are talking about something, but there's no way to figure out from a brand side of the perspective what those people are talking about. So I actually look at things that are like a WeChat from Asia that are very popular. I think there will be a version of that will ultimately be big in the United States. I don't know if that will be something that Facebook will build necessarily, because I think right now, because of a lot of scrutiny with data, there's the chance for a smaller company to sort of build that. But messaging services, again, are very big because people are less likely now to want to just have to exclaim everything that they're doing in public, especially younger people now. They're much more on the intimate side of the spectrum. What we're finding is older people are happy to sort of say like, hey, look what I did today with my dog and cat. But younger people aren't wanting to share all that information.
Do you think that's why Snapchat reverted to some of their programs after the lashback?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think I think they had a design flaw when they redesigned, which has sort of hurt them, but I don't count them out of the game. I think also the fact they want to visualize more. Like ultimately, where we have to look in the next, 6 to 7 years is, how many times do we really want to pull a phone out of our pocket? And I think where they're going basically with glasses, even though people think that's weird, that might be sort of the future of how we look at things, especially as augmented reality takes off. I mean, there's a big area now where more billboards and sort of print advertising is going to be AR enabled, as well as physical experiences. So if you show up at a park, what's AR enabled that you can see through AR that you can't see through your eyes? That's a big area that I think, if someone's going to actually sponsor, hint, hint, a surf competition, how do you actually AR enable something that's basically in the ocean that you can only see through AR? Because it goes back to that Insta Syndrome. Not everyone has to see it, but when they see it online, that's when it sort of takes off and everyone talks about how unique and interesting it is. It also doesn't require physical setup. You can actually program all these things, and the cost of that is actually a fraction of what it costs to sort of set something up physically. So those are another big thing that I think companies are looking into because they want to diminish their footprint in terms of the things that they actually have to produce that might go into a garbage dump at the end of the day. Any other questions? Well, I hope you'll buy me a beer, or not buy me a beer. I hope you'll have a beer, even though I had the Nickelback.
At least. I'm not holding it in